Hello and welcome back to George Past the Post. Well, as promised, for those of you who made it through all the way to the end of the 10 minutes of the last video, this video is going to look at hung parliaments and what might happen if there is a hung parliament after the next UK election currently scheduled to take place in 2029. But first of all, what does the term hung parliament mean? And where is the term widely used? Well, the term hung parliament is mainly used in countries that have majoritarian voting systems. So first past the post, preferential voting with single member seats, two-round system. Basically where you're electing single member constituencies and where usually one party will have an overall majority on their own. So they'll be forming a majority government. And a hung parliament is a term used to describe a situation where, after an election, despite a majoritarian system, no single party has a majority of the seats. Now, the term hung parliament isn't really used as much in countries that have a proportional voting system because, well, every election is effectively a hung parliament because it's quite rare for any party to have a majority on their own because you'd need to get much closer to 50% of the vote. So it's used mainly in countries that, yes, use majoritarian systems. So generally, a hung parliament is an exception rather than the rule, although for a while in the sort of 2010s when we had 2010 and 2017 produced hung parliaments and only 2015 had a majority, people started to think, maybe hung parliaments will be the norm. But then 2019 and 2024 revealed that not necessarily to be the case. Majority governments reasserted itself. So it's worth exploring in the UK. So because they're rare events, there's often a lot of confusion about what happens if there's a hung parliament, the process, who can or should be appointed Prime Minister, what the incumbent Prime Minister should or shouldn't do, when they should or shouldn't resign, how long they should take to resign if they're not going to form a government. So before I get on to 2029 and what might happen, we've got two examples recently of hung parliaments in the UK. The first was in 2010 when the Conservatives were the largest party but fell short of a majority. And 5 days later, there was a coalition government formed between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. There was a potential alternative option of a Labour and Lib Dem coalition. They would have also needed to get the support of the one Green MP that was there at the time and possibly Scottish and Welsh nationalists as well. But in the end, it was a Conservative and Lib Dem coalition government that was formed. So with the coalition government, obviously two or more, in that case it was two parties, joined together and form the government. So you'll have, the two parties will have cabinet ministers, they'll have ministers in each department. And in terms of parliamentary votes, the government sort of, for those 5 years, yes, it was a coalition, but they acted as a majority in that stuff that was in the agreed programme of the coalition, they acted as a majority government. But in 2017, again, the Conservatives fell short, but the context was very different. The Liberal Democrats wouldn't have wanted to support the Conservatives at that time because of Brexit and various other things. Instead, the Conservatives managed to get the support of the DUP, the Democratic Unionist in Northern Ireland, and the Conservatives formed a minority government with a confidence and supply agreement with the DUP. A confidence and supply agreement is basically, it's not a coalition, but it's where a party that's not in government agrees to support the government in votes of confidence and votes on the budget. That's the supply bit. Now, those are two very different types of government. One is where, while there's a lot of compromise between the parties in coalitions, but once they sort of agree on certain policies, they there's a bit more harmony, or at least there was in that particular government. Where you have a minority government, and of course you don't have to have a confidence and supply agreement. It helps, but you don't have to. But where you have a minority government, beyond the formal votes of no confidence or votes on the budget, effectively, if you don't have a majority, it's very difficult to get legislation passed. And in the UK and countries where they have first past the post, politics is set up in the first past the post world. Therefore, there's a lot more tribalism. Therefore, parties are not used to working together. Therefore, it's harder for there to be compromises in terms of passing legislation. So anyway, those are the two examples that we have had in recent history. So looking forward to 2029, if there is a hung parliament, there are probably 4 main scenarios. One, based on current polling, so this may all change. And of course, anything's possible first past the post. But at this moment in time, if there's a hung parliament, scenario 1 is where Reform are the largest party but don't get a majority. And in that scenario, you could probably see Reform forming a minority government and with maybe a confidence and supply agreement, perhaps with one of the smaller parties from Northern Ireland, the UP, maybe, possibly the Conservatives. This is not to say the Conservatives would definitely go along with that, but where they're not where they don't have a majority, but they're just short, a confidence and supply agreement would be enough to get them over the line. Scenario 2 is potentially where Reform are still the largest party, but they're a bit lower down. They have fewer MPs. And maybe a coalition is formed between Reform and the Conservatives. Again, this is not to say the Conservatives would do this, but it's just a possible scenario. In that case, it would be a bit like the Conservative Lib Dem coalition, where there would be negotiations, they would agree on a coalition platform or coalition agreement, and that would be their focus. That would be the policies that they would then want to implement. And you'd have Reform and Conservative cabinet ministers around the table. And scenario 3, however, is where, in those first 2 scenarios, the Reform leader would probably most likely be appointed as Prime Minister, because Reform would either be the minority government or they would be the largest coalition party. This is important for the third scenario. The third scenario is where I'm not sure who the biggest party would be, possibly still Reform, but let's say in this scenario, and again, this is not to say that these 3 parties would want to work together necessarily, but let's just, for the sake of argument, let's say a combination of Labour, Lib Dems and the Greens had a majority. So you have a, shall we say, for want of a better phrase, a progressive or sort of centre-left or non-conservative / Reform government that could be formed. Now, in this scenario, it might not be clear which party leader would get to be Prime Minister. It might be that, because we don't know what the numbers would be, if the Greens had more seats out of Liberal Democrats and Labour, the Green Party, and part of the negotiations between these parties might be who gets to be the Prime Minister. So you might get a Green Prime Minister, you might get a Labour Prime Minister. If they can't agree, perhaps a Liberal Democrat Prime Minister as a compromise. The point here is that, contrary to what some believe, the monarch that appoints the Prime Minister, they do not have to appoint the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons. They don't have to then even appoint the leader of the second largest party in the House of Commons. They have to appoint whoever is the most likely person to command confidence in the House of Commons. And in this third scenario, where maybe maybe Labour and the Greens and Lib Dems are quite close together, or certainly Labour and the Greens, it may be unclear who the Prime Minister would be, and so that may be part of the negotiations in a way that it wasn't in 2010. As in, Labour, Liberal Democrats had said if they were going to go with Labour, they couldn't have Gordon Brown. But in terms of the negotiation with the Conservatives, there was no suggestion that David Cameron wouldn't be Prime Minister. But that's a key point, that if it's this third scenario of maybe three parties, it may not. It could be the Green Party leader becomes Prime Minister, maybe the Labour leader gets to be Prime Minister, or perhaps, say, Labour were the largest party of the three, but part of the price of coalition might be you have to change the leader. Especially if that leader, whoever that may be, whether it's Keir Starmer or somebody else, would have just presided over Labour losing lots of seats. Now, scenario 4 is where either the numbers don't add up for any of the three scenarios I've put together, or even if the numbers are there, the politics and the campaign that's just gone make it impossible for a deal to be done. So let's say if the Conservatives have spent the campaign trying to distance themselves from Nigel Farage, they may not feel they can go into coalition with Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage may not want the Conservative Party to be in a government led by him. Labour and the Greens may not want to work with each other after the election. Liberal Democrats, they've been burnt by coalition before. They may not want to go into government again, even if it's in a different circumstance. Or, of course, the numbers may just not add up. In this scenario, and in all the scenarios really, the current Prime Minister stays in office until somebody can replace them, until it's clear. Now, if that doesn't become clear, then effectively the minute an election's called, the government goes into caretaker mode. That caretaker mode usually ends when the new Prime Minister is appointed. That caretaker period would just effectively continue if no government could be formed. And it would be interesting to see what would happen in terms of a King's Speech. Would that still happen? I mean, the Parliament would have to meet at some point. You might get a scenario where you maybe have several different minority governments formed, where maybe Parliament keeps voting out. They may, if there's no formal agreement, if Labour still has the government, but House of Commons overwhelmingly opposed to Labour, the House of Commons might say, right, well, we can all unite against Labour, we're going to vote Labour out. Then, potentially, Reform get appointed in a minority situation. Then maybe they can't form a government either. Then perhaps the Greens. I mean, I'm not necessarily sure that you would actually want to have appointing several different Prime Ministers over several days. But it may, if it becomes clear that no government can be formed at all, even on a sort of interim basis. So actually what I forgot to say is confidence and supply agreement, or even a coalition agreement, they could set a time limit on it. They could say for a year to provide stability, we will allow a government to be formed. But in the scenario where no government can be formed at all, then you're probably looking at another election. But there may still be a sense of, from the public and perhaps the monarch, they may want to encourage the politicians to at least try and make the Parliament that's just been elected work. There are examples in Australian states and Canadian provinces where they have a similar system where the governor or governors if it's state, lieutenant governor in Canada if it's provinces, in case you wanted to know, where you've had a hung parliament, no government can really be formed, and premiers perhaps asked for an early election, and they've been denied if it's been within 6 months. If it's still within 6 months, because the argument is, well, we've just had an election, you should try and make it work. So, yes, anyway, that's what a hung parliament is. Hope you've enjoyed this video. These are all possible scenarios of what might happen if there's a hung parliament, from, 3 possible scenarios, and then a fourth where politics gets in the way of the numbers, and no government can really be formed on a stable basis. And in all of this, even if any of those 3 scenarios come to pass, we don't have a fixed term parliament anymore. So a Prime Minister could try and call an election earlier at any point. But then also the opposition, if it's a scenario where the government doesn't have a majority, the opposition would also be circling and looking, if we bring the government down now. So it would be quite an unstable period. potentially. But for an election enthusiast like myself, bring it on.